Hey, welcome. I am Fred Wellman, host of On Democracy, the FP Wellman. This is What's Really Going On with FP Wellman, special episode where we discuss major issues, a little bit more conversational, and we're going to we talk to experts, we talk to what's going on in the news right now, and I'm very excited to have a great conversation with Dr. Robert Pape. He's from the University of Chicago. We'll do his whole bio in a second, but in the meantime, let's get rocking. I am so excited to have this conversation. Let's do it. Welcome to On Democracy. Welcome. Again, I am Fred Wellman, host of On Democracy FP Wellman and the On Democracy Substack and everywhere else you can find us. I'm thrilled to have you here. As we get started, remember, subscribe to the On Democracy Substack. We've got a huge sale going on right now, fpwellman.substack.com. 25% off forever. You can't beat that. In addition, of course, our YouTube channel, On Democracy on YouTube. All those things. I got to plug them or I get in trouble with the people who pay for these things, which is my fiance. Look, I'm really excited to have this conversation. Dr. Robert Pape is a professor of political science at the University of Chicago. He studied political violence for 3 decades. He directs the Chicago Center for Security and Threats. He's got some really cool stuff happening, some really great new initiatives that I'm thrilled to talk about, and a very important conversation about what's really going on right now, the dangers we face, and the mistakes we can make. As you know, I'm one of the organizers for Unite for Veterans, Unite for America. We're going to have veterans on the National Mall on June 6th. And I had a conversation with Dr. Pape about 2 weeks ago, and I'm like, Jesus, we got to get you on the show. And so here we are. Let's welcome Dr. Pape to the show.
It's great to talk to you again, Fred. I felt like a couple weeks ago we could have gone on for hours.
I know. I'm like talking. I'm like, okay, stop talking. I got to get this on camera. It's like one of those conversations.
Like so dinners that just go on and on until 3 a.m.
Yeah, exactly. I said, we got this different. This isn't the usual show, so I'm thrilled to have you here. Thanks for taking time. And I was laughing. We were laughing the pre-show that I think I've rescheduled him like 6 times. I'm a very patient man. If you're at the University of Chicago, sign up for Dr. Pape's classes.
Their birthday. literally the staff at the university is hanging outside the doors, and every seat has been filled with so much happening here.
That's amazing. And look, the reason we want to talk is, protests are growing across the country. As I mentioned, I'm involved in some. I was here at the Hands Off rallies here in St. Louis. Of course, I'm one of the organizers for the Unite for Veterans. You've studied them for years and the arc of what they can lead to. What's your initial thoughts on what's all unfolding in our country right now as Trump administration continue their assault on our rights and everything else, but a growing protest movement is growing. And as you watch this unfold, what's your initial thoughts?
My initial thought is the way to save democracy is democracy. And what we're seeing with protests is democracy in action. And what is certainly the history of protests is that when protests are large and peaceful, and we need to put in that other word, when they're large,
that's the key to this conversation right there.
There is really very little that can stop those movements. The best example of this in still some of the folks listening lifetimes, and of course not everybody, is in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. So what we saw in the 1960s was these large marches and protests in Washington, D.C., organized by Martin Luther King and others. 1963, the march from Selma to Montgomery, of course, in 1965. These are amazing, peaceful, large, peaceful, and they lead to rather dramatic change. The 1964 civil rights laws could not really, no one really could imagine them happening outside of this context. The Great Society programs, Medicaid, which we now, of course, we see it taking away in some ways. Is under assault. Well, it's really hard to imagine, Fred, these amazing outcomes happening without this major political protest, which is democracy in action. Well, but we also need to then talk about the back half of the 1960s, because as great as that was, the back half of the 1960s, for most people, what's famous about them is the violence and the chaos. Chicago, the assassinations, Days of Rage. This is a very different world where essentially protests are going sideways
Yeah.
And what are the results of that? You might say, well, you break make an omelet, you got to break a few eggs. Well, the real results were 8 years of Richard Nixon, or almost 8 years. Watergate shortened that. But basically, what you saw was the violence essentially mobilized the middle of the country in the opposite direction of where the positive movement had taken the country. So it's really important to see the two parts of the 1960s, and then the real potential when things go sideways for this to lead to massive political change that's actually counterproductive to the
Right.
objectives of the massive protest movement, which was so productive. So this is why it's important to talk about this, because when people with a quick soundbite say, "Oh yeah, the protests never produce anything," or so forth, this is just too simplistic of an
Yeah.
understanding. The mass peaceful protest, there is nothing really more powerful in a democracy. This is democracy in action. Arguably today, the courts are basically not standing up for democracy as much as you might think that they would. Politicians not, parties not. Well, the way to move democracy forward here is, of course, peaceful protest, but it's got to be emphasis on that word peaceful. And even things that go sideways, you might say 5-10%, can take up all the oxygen, can do a lot to be counterproductive. And that's really what's crucial to focus on here as we go forward.
And I guess that's the key, right? I mean, as you watch these, look, like every week there's a new group forming. I'm one of them. They're putting together these rallies. Some are more aggressive than others. I mean, you can have an honest conversation that Indivisible does it one way, but this new 50-51 movement's a little bit more aggressive than others.
Yeah.
They're more into red action, which is sometimes could be violent. As you watch this unfold as a historian and as a professor on these stuff, I mean, are there lessons you're kind of, do you see yourself talking to your TV saying, okay, don't do that, or hey, as you get this going, what should you be doing? I mean, a lot of people watch this show and read this are going to say, hey, I'm doing these protests. What's the lesson here?
Well, the big lesson is you can't lecture people. It's not going to work because again, we're a democracy and we want democracy in action. So this is not about being on your high horse and you're lecturing people. And there will be, Fred, as you said, people looking for their space, their contribution to the cause, so to speak. Here. And so they're looking, how do they make a mark? Well, what's important, though, is again, I'm just going to come back to the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was not, hey, let's just have a bunch of protests and then see where it goes.
Right.
There were some pretty important, they were nebulous, of course, at first, but pretty important positive political objectives. Here. And that is important to keep the channel, so to speak, that anger that can sometimes go sideways and be, again, dramatically counterproductive. But it's that it's not just this like lecturing stuff and admonition stuff from the wise old people, right? That's that's not going to work. And it doesn't.
It's not enough just to yell and scream, right? You've got to have a plan, right? I mean, like we talked about with Unite for Veterans, I'm running on the screen right now. I've been telling my colleagues as we organize, like, hey, the number one question we're going to get, let's plan for success. Let's say 10,000 veterans and supporters show up at the National Mall. The number one question at about 2 hours or 2 to 3 hours is going to be, what's next? This was great. Now what, right?
I mean, for example, let me just off the cuff give an example for the veterans, which is start a movement called No Veterans Left Behind.
Right.
I mean, what we have, of course, we know the famous phrase, no person left behind and so forth from the active. But you could start this movement where the whole idea is to move forward with the support for veterans, which, by the way, my mother-in-law, 95 years old, her husband was due veterans benefits. She, as a widow, was due those veterans benefits. I, as a professor, worked for almost 2 years to try to punch through the paperwork. Now she's 95. She
Yeah.
can't do
Right.
this. We
Right.
had like the so-called helper, which wasn't all that much help. I don't mean to indict that person. She was wonderful as a human being. But here I am. I'm a full tenured professor at the University of Chicago. I'm pretty good at filling out paperwork, if nothing else. All
I
right.
would think at
I'm
this point,
going
yeah.
through again, round after round after round, and I have to say, it's because I work with some people in Congress here, and I could tell them the sob story
Yeah.
here. That's what it took to get her veterans, those veterans benefits, which she
Survivor
was
benefits.
due. I mean, due for a long period of time. And
Yeah.
so I'm just pointing out that this is really, I know a little bit about this up close and personal of how hard this is. And this just should not be. You cannot have people in their 80s and 90s being asked to go through round after round after round. And it's quite clear. They all feel like it. They all get the message, which is they don't want to support us. They just want us to die. And this drives them, this makes it's depressing to them. They get very upset.
Right.
Anyway, so I really believe that there's some obvious positive programs here for veterans, and there needs to be some names given to it, a little bit of substance. And at the rallies here, I mean, half the time should be spent trying to mobilize more people, and half the time should be spent on organizing here to get these programs through, so that it becomes like not just another day on media and social media, but it's back to the early part of the 1960s where there's an actual program to direct this energy to.
Right. And that's the tough thing right now is many of us are just trying to stop the assault right at this point. It's a little bit different in the 60s. As I've explained to others, I talk a lot is, we're in the phase of this whole thing where the assault, like it's kind of like the Japanese march across the Pacific is a term I use a lot of, and when we first started that fight after Pearl Harbor, our biggest goal was just to stop the movement as they took over country and island and others, and then hold them until we could organize our forces and push back. I think these movements almost feels like in many ways are just at this point trying to stop it. But you're right. We have to think about also what do we want? Like it's not enough to be angry and threatening, because we had to have a goal. But on that note, it does also worry me that because that is sort of where we are, is so many people are angry. We just had a horrific and absolutely unacceptable shooting of two Jewish Israeli embassy staffers in DC. It's terrifying. The university movements, the protests, in many ways, those protests are feeding. It makes me nervous, especially after you and I talked 2 weeks ago. Are these campus protests? Just my alma mater, Harvard, had their international visas stripped from them as retaliation, allegedly, for these protests. Do you worry that these campus protests are leading to things like last night? I mean, is that something you've seen? You study political violence.
Well, and we'll talk more about the details of this, and also the campus unrest in detail, and also other elements in detail. Now, let's start with the big picture about what it's important for people to know, that I know, that I think it would be helpful for them to know, which is we are a tinderbox of a country. And this is a tinderbox of a country, as you'll hear me explain, across the political spectrum. It's not just a tinderbox on the right or a tinderbox on the left. We have a tinderbox across the political spectrum. The second big thing to tell you is that political violence is a slippery slope. So we've done major analyses of anti-Semitism and the overlap of anti-Semitism and support for political violence for grievances on the left and grievances on the right that are not clearly anti-Semitic at all. And what we found was stunning. What we found is the more somebody supported political violence, say to stop police brutality against blacks by police, the more likely they were to be anti-Semitic. The more somebody supported political violence in favor of Donald Trump, the more likely they were to be anti-Semitic. And also the reverse. The more somebody was anti-Semitic, the more they were likely to support these other violence for these other goals. Now, what does that mean? It means political violence is a slippery slope. We
Right.
tend to want to compartmentalize it, Fred. We tend to
Yep.
want to think, well, this is a Jewish problem, or this is a university problem, or this is a Republican Party or a Democratic Party problem, or so forth. This, I think, this might have been something, the way to think about it 20 years ago, when it was a very minor problem and very fringe and so forth.
Yeah.
It's not what's happening today. What's
Right.
happening today is that it's more of a slippery slope, and that support is a bit like Jello morphing. So that's where you see there's support for political violence. It's leading to assassination attempts in the fall, and then all of a sudden it's leading to support for Mangione and the shooting of a CEO. How is that happening? That's happening because it's a slippery slope. You see what I mean, Fred?
Yeah.
So this, and the way to combat it then is not to treat it as a compartmentalized, isolated issue, that horrible, tragic shooting is just a Jewish problem, and it's only the Jewish community needs to worry about that. No, because the more that happens in one area, the more this is going to spread. So that's why we've started this new movement, this new initiative at the University of Chicago, Project on Security and Threats. It has its own website. The website is standunited.media. And what this is about is standing united against political violence. Our national surveys, which we've been doing for years about support for political violence in the United States, shows that there is this radical support on both sides of the political spectrum, but 75% of Americans abhor political violence.
Right.
At the moment, they have nowhere to go.
Right.
We're trying to create an echo chamber for those people, an anchor for those people. We want to create that echo chamber and anchor for conversations among those people. We want to grow this. And right now, it's almost impossible given the way things have been so spliced up. And so this is something that's a whole new initiative. Glad to tell you more about the pieces of it. We're partnered with a long time Canadian film producer of documentaries for decades. His name is John Long. I'm, of course, longtime professor of political science. It's an unusual partnership to bring this together, but there's a whole lot we can do and we want to do here going forward, but it's all based on understanding of the actual what's happening in America in some depth. And that's what I've been spending the last 5 years focusing on. And now we're moving out in a way that we believe can make a real difference and really connect with all the organizers here that you work with, Fred, because this is something that we can build, and I believe we can build a positive agenda for our democracy.
Yeah, and that's where we're trying to go, right? And that's what I'm, many of us are doing this. We want to raise awareness. We want to get people into the fight, if you will, but that fight has to be peaceful. Especially now, we're seeing clearly that the Trump regime, if you will, is very interested. I mean, they're ready to strike the minute we cross the line. They're ready. They're using any excuse they can to masked men, disappearing international students. It's a very. I feel like in many ways it's almost more dangerous than the 60s. And this administration is ready to go, isn't it?
I'm sorry to say it is in some ways more dangerous than the 60s. It's even more dangerous than the first Trump administration.
Yeah.
Because we're actually in a situation where Donald Trump, as president now, has looked to staff up the most senior cabinet officials here with people who will do even more than he asked in the first time. So obviously that's true with Mike Pence and the vice president. But so too, Mark Espers was Secretary of Defense who refused to shoot protesters. And Trump said, well, couldn't you even shoot them in the knee? I mean, this is really so this is the background here, where we live. So if we think about the situation we're in today, that sort of potential for protests to go sideways can have not only consequences in electoral consequences down the road that are counterproductive for the movement, but
Yeah.
also in the near term. How would you get martial law in the United States? How would that actually happen?
Right.
Well, we have an event June 14th. I'm going June 14th. I want to see what's going to happen, because obviously there's going to be the Trump military parade, but also we know likely large scale counter protests. Well, this is an event that, just imagine Donald Trump gives himself a birthday present and on that day announces to the crowd that he's pardoning Derek Chauvin. Just imagine that. That is sort of an explosive thing in this situation, and it's not like, oh, nobody would ever do that before. It's not like we had a president give a speech on the ellipse for a crowd of, yeah, exactly. You see what I mean? So
There's that.
these are things we need to take seriously.
There's
And
hints. Yeah. The hints are there.
the hints are there. So we've been through some of this before. And so this
Yeah.
is why we need to really talk about this and really think about this, because this is how then things could go sideways. And you could end up in a situation where not only you have martial law, but significant support for the public. See, we've just done, just to give you more background here, we do these quarterly nationally representative surveys of Americans and their support for political violence. We've been doing them for over 3 years. And these are the gold standard, Fred.
Yeah.
They're very expensive. We do them with NORC at the university. This isn't undergraduates dialing on the phone or something here. This is the real thing. And what we just did, we've just done one that came out just literally a week ago. And what we found is 24% of Republicans agree that Donald Trump should use the military to suppress protests against the Trump agenda. 24% of Republicans agree with that. Another third, Fred, are okay with that, meaning they're ambivalent. They're not opposed. So just wait a second here. This is a pretty big finding. Now, I also want to say, because again, we look at this on both the right and the left, that what's important to know is that 40% of Democrats agree the use of force to remove Donald Trump from the presidency is justified. So we have a situation where there's a tinderbox here. You see what I mean? We're going to be having you're not stopping the protests as we go forward, Fred. So the concern that somehow this is going to stop. I mean, Trump this morning is announcing 50% more tariffs on Europe. I mean, oh my goodness gracious, this is just going on and on. So you're going to see enormous energy. We need to be looking forward. We need to understand the situation, just the way your podcast says. We need to say what is happening, what's happening now in our country. And then we need to go even further to think about how can we move forward productively in this situation. And I believe we can do it. This is how we as a democracy make great strides. We've done this before. We can do this again.
Yeah, and I tell the stories a lot, Robert. We're recording this on the Friday before Memorial Day weekend. I lived in Baghdad. I did 3 tours in Iraq, and I lived there when conversations and politics ended with guns, right? And I tell my fellow Americans all the time, I say, you don't understand. I've lived in a country where that was awash with guns, and disagreements ended with guns, and political violence was normal. Muqtada al-Sadr was, I spent a lot of my time laying in bed listening to mortars go over my head from Sadr City, because Muqtada al-Sadr wanted power, wanted to be a part of the government, and decided that he'd use a militia to do it. I've lived that life. I've witnessed the death. I've lost Iraqi friends to it. And I don't want that here, And I remember sitting in Iraq in 2003, 5, 8, thinking to myself, thank God it's not like this in America. And here we are in 2025. And people ask me all the time, why do you spend so much energy and time? And frankly, there's risk of fighting this battle of, one, wanting to resist this government and this authoritarian movement, but also urging my fellow Americans that violence is not the way. It's
Well, and
you know, it's
we
you
come
know,
at this, Fred, from such a similar viewpoint here. So,
yeah.
how did I shift from studying international
Yeah.
political
Well, that's the thing. I
violence?
read your bio.
Good.
You've written books. You've
Well,
bought
why
books
would
on
I do
international.
that?
How the hell
Well,
did you get here?
yeah, and a lot of people say, "Oh, it happened after January 6th." No, it happened a year before January 6th, when there was not this rise of political violence in the United States. And what happened? What happened is in March 2020, as we're going to the lockdowns, like many people, I saw the federal government fumbling, telling us to drink bleach. I mean, seriously?
I was
Okay.
running a COVID hospital,
So,
brother.
so we all knew right away the federal government is a problem. Number two, like a lot of people, I thought that would mean we would see mass deaths, and 1 million dead to COVID is more per capita deaths than America had in World War I or World War II. Just to be clear, that's a pretty big point. But not like other people, from my background in studying overseas political violence, I also suspected that once you believe your government is actually going to hurt you, there would be more potential for political violence. So that's when I revectored things from my center. I had that, and we're going home anyway. So let's revector for the spring term. And we started to do historical studies on political violence in the United States in detail. Of course, we knew some. And this is why we were just ready to go. And we tracked the George Floyd protests and riots in the top 100 cities in America on a daily basis with large research teams. And about 5 to 7% of those protests were riots here.
Right.
But those involved hundreds of thousands of people smashing in. So now, then, as we're starting to write this up, because that's a lot of data to process if you think about it, okay, that's January 6th happens. And then we become one of the world's experts on January 6th, where study each and every individual. We know more about the demographics and background than maybe anybody here. That's one of the big reasons the media has gotten interested in our studies. Even the FBI was using our studies, because what people don't know is the FBI doesn't actually do much aggregate analysis of their individual work. That's just not really what their job is. So anyway, but this is how we got into this. So we were worried here about the future. And then unfortunately, that worry has become the case. And we now live in what I call the era of violent populism. This is not a civil war. The movies of the Civil War, I think, are over dramatic, at least for now. But what's happening is we are in a historically high period of political violence like we haven't seen in over 50 years in our country. And we need to recognize this as not one-offs and individual problems here and compartmentalize violence. This is an era of violent populism. And unfortunately, it could get worse. The 2026 election could be even more fraught, 2028 beyond that. So we're moving in a direction here where we need to take this seriously. And that's why I think we need to rechannel it. We need to stand united against political violence, standunited.media. And we need to then have positive political programs.
Very good.
Me,
as a media professional.
You're teaching me. I've watched some of you. I've learned.
This is how it works, folks. You're seeing the magic. You're seeing the magic.
And you're seeing the professor could be the student.
I know. Look at this, man. Look at you.
I'm taking notes.
I'm telling you, man. I tell you that we learn from each other on these things. So, well, I couldn't agree more. I rigidly agree. It's funny. John Long brought us together. John helped me do a very good. One of my most popular shows I've ever done was about the January 6th protests. Of course, he provided footage I'd never seen before, and many had never seen before.
Amazing.
Just gutting to watch unfold. Yeah,
on the ground insight, and then the interviews, and we have one of the greatest interviews on our Stand United media, which you won't see anywhere else. And one of these, and what you will see is a Trump supporter, a woman, on January 7th. she will talk about how horrible, how she was coming to peacefully support her President Trump. And
Yeah.
what happened is it devolved into chaos and violence that she thought was completely un-American, against the Constitution. She's rejecting this. And this is, she's standing literally on the Capitol grounds the next morning talking about this. And only John Long has that. And this is what we can do, and why this approach we're taking of joining forces here, the academic institution, the film producer, coming together, not like once a year, but on a daily basis. This is a new approach. We have a big problem. We need new approaches. And this shows you the power of what can happen, Fred, because you can see the people talking here. This is what John does. He creates these moments that matter. And the moments that matter are not the lectures from the politicians and the professors, okay? I mean, we'd like to believe that's what moves the world, but we know that's not it. It's democracy. It's the people. In order to do that, you need to capture the people in the moment here. So one of the big things we want to do is we want to send John's cruise to June 14th, for example. And so this is how we want to grow this thing. We don't just want to have just the Anchor website is only the beginning here. We believe we can really recreate what John has been doing basically his whole life. And we can do it in the service of democracy. And by the way, as a Canadian who's now facing the possibility of, so he has a little bit of an interest in democracy in America. So it's not
we all do all of a sudden, don't we?
It's not just a hobby here.
Yeah, I get it. Well, I've taken a lot of your time. I know you got to do your day job. One more time, tell me what makes StandUnited.media so special, and where else they can find you, brother.
What makes StandUnited.media special is we're standing united against political violence across the political spectrum. This is an echo chamber for that 70 to 75% of Americans who abhor political violence and who want all of our positive, all of our energy to go toward a positive political program, so that we don't just flail away, and we certainly don't hand a kind of an easy way to slide into martial law here, because this is one of the big dangers that we face. And so join us at StandUnited.media.
Couldn't have done better. You are a pro, obviously polished professional. I appreciate you. Thanks for taking so much of your time with me and educating me. I mean, I'm not going to lie to you. It's not often that during a show I'm furiously taking notes. And well done, Professor.
This is a bit of a, we're teaching each other here. Seriously.
I appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Well, thank you so much, sir. Have a great day. And thanks for joining us. Good luck in this mission. And obviously we'll be in touch, and we'll be having you back. We'll get John on here, show some footage. I think I'll be seeing John June 6th. I think he'll be joining us in DC, as a matter of fact. So I really appreciate it.
Awesome.
All right, sir.
Fantastic.
Talk to you soon. Hold on.
Absolutely.
Great conversation with a great, brilliant man. We could go for another hour. We didn't even get the veterans' involvement in violence, which is shocking as well, which is why we're thinking. So, as I mentioned in the interview, as I wrap this up, I've lived in countries where political violence is the norm. If you see me strongly rejecting the idea, you'll see people, some of you nice folks on Blue Sky and Substack will make a comment saying, hey, the only way we're going to end this is with a revolution or violence. I'm strongly against that. I believe that we still have the democratic ways to stop this movement and push this movement away from us without violence. Because the thing you have to remember is violence is a two-way street. And unfortunately, at this moment, Donald Trump and his MAGA movement control much of the state power, the state violence. Okay. And there's no way around that, folks. Don't have some fantasies that your little AR-15 is going to make a goddamn bit of difference against an MQ-9 Reaper drone. Don't make a mistake thinking that you can overpower the ICE agents running around with masks on. They have the control of our state violence. And that means they have a lot of power. And the minute we give them an opening to attack us, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. And I just don't want that to happen. Like I said, I've seen I've lost allies way too much in my career in 22 years in the Army. And we'll talk about that during Memorial Day weekend, I'm sure. But in the meantime, thanks for joining this. I hope you'll spread this one. We're doing it a little bit differently. It's not for the it's for our general audience here on Democracy and on Substack. I would love you to forward this to your friends and spread the word of what Robert's doing and what Stand United Media is doing. I do believe it's important. There is great danger on June 14th. You'll notice I have not promoted any of the protest for the parade. And a number of folks have said, "Hey, Fred, how come you don't support stopping the parade or protesting it or the military disobeying the order?" Because it's a parade, y'all. It's a parade. It's not the end of the world. I'm much more concerned. I would much rather have our United States military, the men and women that serve our nation that I used to serve with and have friends still serving. I want them to keep their powder dry, as you would say, until there's really a threat. When they're ordered to shoot protesters, when they're ordered to use military power against peaceful protests, I want them to reserve their decision to disobey an illegal order at that moment. Because I know, folks, I'm sorry to tell you this, Donald Trump having a parade is legal. It's stupid. It's asinine. It's a waste of money, but it is legal. Okay. We've got to pick our battles on these kind of things. I don't say that often because I think everything's important, and it is important we resist it. But in the end, disrupting it or causing violence is not the answer. So we have to reserve our powder for knowing that state violence is possible, and we don't want a part of that. Again, I've lost friends. My interpreter was beheaded, okay, because he worked for the Americans. One of my partners, the Iraqi Joint Headquarters, who ran their public affairs, stepped out of his house in Baghdad and a motorcycle pulled up and executed him. Okay. I've lived this life and seen what happens. Dr. or Sheikh Rod, who was a lieutenant colonel in the Iraqi army, executed in his home. Dr. Muhammad, who worked with me, was executed in his clinic. I've lost so many to political violence. I know what happens, and you don't want a goddamn part of it. That's my editorial. Hey, thanks for joining the special episode of What's Really Going On. I hope you like it. I hope you love these. We'll be doing more of these. I really enjoy these conversations. I hope you do too. Find us on YouTube. Find us on Substack. Find us everywhere. Share with all your friends. And remember, I told you, we've got a great sale going on the Substack paid subscriptions. Why paid subscription? Well, we're starting to do things for Substack paid subscribers. And on top of that, it pays for all this. It allows us to do this work and do this work for you. So I hope you appreciate it. Thank you for joining me here on What's Really Going On with FP Wellman. I will see you again soon. We've got so much more to come. Stay in the fight, folks. I hope you have a good Memorial Day weekend. I'll see you on the other side.